You think silence is absence, a pause between thoughts, a moment when nothing is happening. You speak to connect, to be understood, to fill the distance between yourself and others. Meaning, you believe appears only when sound moves. Yet Shams Tabreez questioned this belief. He said silence is not a break in dialogue, but its purest form, the point where all separation dissolves. To him, silence was not withdrawal, but participation in truth itself. Speech may reveal what you think, but silence reveals what you are. It does not conceal understanding. It completes it. If silence speaks more truth than language, what kind of hearing does it demand? And if you were to stop speaking altogether, would meaning disappear or finally become clear? In the 13th century, Shams Tabreez unsettled both scholars and seekers. He refused the comfort of repetition, challenging learning that echoed without transformation. When he met Rumi, the exchange between them was not of words, but of awareness. Rumi's intellect broke open before the quiet intensity of Shams. He called this silence a fire that consumes noise. For Shams, speech divided reality into opposites, while silence restored their unity. He taught that divine knowledge does not enter through explanation, but through a still mind, one that no longer needs to argue, prove, or defend. You assume speech brings clarity. You define, explain, and name. Believing truth grows clearer with precision. Yet every word divides what it describes. When you say this or that, you separate one from the whole. Shams saw that speech serves the mind's need for control. It makes experience manageable, but never whole. Words do not create understanding. They frame it within limits. They point toward meaning, but cannot contain it. The more you rely on language, the more you mistake description for reality. If truth is boundless, can it ever be captured by the fragments that speech must create to exist? Shams redefined silence as active awareness, not emptiness. He said silence is the space in which meaning speaks itself. Speech begins in silence and must return to it, just as thought arises within awareness and falls back into it. In that return, understanding ripens. Silence is not refusal, but the willingness to let truth appear without interference. It is not the absence of communication, but its source. When nothing is forced, what is real begins to articulate itself. If silence precedes and completes every word, then perhaps the highest conversation with the divine is the one in which no effort remains to speak. You notice how uneasy you become when silence stretches. The moment words end, the mind begins to fill the gap. You replay conversations, imagine replies, defend your image. Shams called this the noise of the ego, the voice that cannot stop asserting itself. It speaks not to communicate, but to confirm existence. Silence threatens this performance because it removes the audience the ego depends on. You fear that if you stop speaking, you might stop being. Yet what if your being does not depend on expression at all? What if the one who speaks to feel real is the very illusion silence exposes? Shams advised his students to listen until listening listens itself. He meant that true hearing begins when the listener disappears. Usually, you listen to prepare a reply, to evaluate, to maintain identity. But when you listen without a self to defend, awareness becomes transparent. Nothing is filtered or owned. Silence is not passive. It is the most alert state possible. It receives without distortion. In this way, listening becomes prayer, not as a request, but as alignment with what is already speaking through everything. If the divine is always communicating, Perhaps the only barrier is the one who insists on listening as me. Shams taught that the divine does not approach. It is already present. What separates us is not distance, but distraction. Speech, thought, and inner commentary create the illusion of movement away from what never left. Silence ends this wandering. In silence, you do not summon presence, you recognize it. What appears as emptiness is unmediated reality. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to arrive. The seeker disappears into what was never absent. Prayer becomes response, and response becomes prayer. If God never ceased speaking, then silence was never the absence of communication, only the clearing of what stood in its way. When silence deepens, speech returns but changes. Words now arise without ownership. They no longer aim to persuade or impress. They reveal what already is. Shams said speech born of silence carries truth because it has no motive. It belongs to no one. In this state, to speak is to let meaning express itself through you, not from you. Communication becomes transparent. Language is used, but no speaker stands behind it. What was once an expression becomes transmission. You realize that divine speech is not extraordinary. It is ordinary speech freed from self-interest. If you could speak without seeking recognition, would anything untrue remain to say? As silence settles, the inner debate loses its force. Thoughts still arise, but none demand belief. Every position softens before becoming identity. Shams described this as the death of the inner court, where judgment and defense used to rule. Without these voices, awareness no longer divides itself. You stop answering questions that never needed to be asked. What remains is clarity without conclusion, perception without commentary. This is not emptiness, but freedom from the need to interpret. When there is nothing left to argue within, who remains to argue with God? And if there is no argument, is there any distance left between you and truth? You now understand that silence was never absence. It was the foundation of every word you ever spoke. Speech and silence are not opposites. They are two moments of one act, the movement of awareness within itself. Shams Tabreez called this the perfection of dialogue, when the listener, the speaker, and the message dissolve into one. The divine does not respond through language because it has never stopped speaking through existence itself. Every sound, every pause, every thought is part of that unbroken communication. When you stop insisting on your own voice, you realize the conversation never ended. Silence was not the end of meaning. It was the point where meaning no longer needed to be said. The exploration begins with the common belief that silence opposes speech. Through Shams Tabreez's reasoning, that assumption dissolves. Speech, when driven by ego, fragments reality. Silence restores unity. The listener learns that silence is not black but presence, the condition through which the divine becomes perceptible. As reflection deepens, even speech is reborn, no longer as assertion but as transparent expression. The journey ends in clarity. Silence and language are not separate states, but one continuous revelation. What begins as a question about absence concludes as recognition that the divine was speaking all along, through both word and stillness.